It's a Minefield is a weekly audio program where we talk getting the most out of life with mental health challenges with fun and love to be enjoyed by the whole community.
On It's a Minefield, we speak with well-known and not so well-known Australians about the issues that affect us as we live with these challenges.
It's the mad leading the mad.
We're pretty in sync with each other. Hello and welcome back to It's a Minefield. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Caroline Zabransky and today we'll be talking about a topic that is so vital to the health and well-being of Australia. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander mental health. We all know there's a big gap between the Indigenous Australian population and other Australians. 10% of that health gap is entirely mental health. Suicide accounted for 5.7% of all deaths of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, while the comparable proportion of non-Indigenous Australians was 1.9%. With Indigenous Australians having a long history of trauma, grief, and cultural disconnection, mental health issues can be complex. This can require culturally appropriate support that recognises the connection between physical health, mental health, spiritual needs, and social and emotional well-being. Today we speak to Dr Tracey Westernman, proud Nyamal woman from the Pilbara region of Western Australia. She holds a postgraduate diploma in psychology, a master's degree in clinical psychology, and a doctorate of philosophy in clinical psychology. She's a recognised world leader in Aboriginal mental health, cultural competency, and suicide prevention, achieving national and international recognition for her work. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Tracey Westernman.
That's all right.
Can you tell us a bit about the work you do in mental health with Indigenous Australians?
Yeah, I guess it's been probably a couple of decades now where I've been, predominantly focused on Indigenous mental health and suicide prevention and throw cultural competency into that mix in particular. And the origins of it, I guess, were really coming down to university as an idealistic 18-year-old kid thinking that I was going to learn all this amazing stuff about, our most vulnerable communities, which have consistently been our Indigenous communities when you look at the statistics. And probably horrifyingly, I sat in lecture theatres and by about third year, the word Aboriginal was not even mentioned once. And so that to me really spoke to the reality of how our practitioners are trained in a way that doesn't actually reflect the statistics of what people are dealing with as practitioners. And so really I set upon a path to ensure that invisibleness did not continue for future generations. And I started off working in very remote communities, and then in 1998 started my business, Indigenous Psychological Services, that is really focused predominantly on making sure that practitioners are trained in accordance with really being able to apply clinical training in a way that is going to be absolutely effective with at-risk Aboriginal people, which is not an easy task, and particularly not an easy task when you're a sole practitioner, but the impacts have been pretty extraordinary in the last 23 years for sure.
Yes, you kind of just answered the question that I was going to ask. Over the last 23 years, the cultural shift, do you feel it's been enough? Do you feel there's more we can do? Of course.
Yeah. Look, there's significantly more we can do, and I think, frankly, universities have really dropped the ball when it comes to ensuring that not just psychologists, we're talking about anyone that's involved in the helping profession. That covers off quite a number of professions. There is still no requirement that those in the helping professions demonstrate minimum standards of cultural competency. And it gets worse when you go into the field of psychology that's really specifically focused on, your really critical needs, mental health needs of our communities. And there is actually no evidence-based curriculum that's embedded within psychology degree in throughout the whole of Australia. Now, what will often happen is people will be trained in a very mainstream way, and then they'll just get I call it a side order of Cultural Awareness 101, which is really not good enough. And so universities really have a significant responsibility here in picking up that reality and training people accordingly.
When you were at university, imagine that you weren't an Aboriginal woman. And do you feel like you would be educated enough on how to deal with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander mental health through the education you received?
Yeah, no, definitely not. And look, sadly, the statistics really talk to this, and I'll throw a couple at you. One is that we know that 6% of Indigenous people in mental health crisis access mental health services. We also know that, we've had 4 inquiries into suicides in Indigenous communities just in Western Australia, 4 successive inquiries over 12 years. And every single one of those inquiries have concluded pretty much the same thing, and that is that children and Indigenous people are continuing to die as a direct result of a lack of access to services or culturally competent services. So what you actually find and see at a practical level is you're getting psychologists that, it's a really noble profession, psychology. So people don't get into psychology without without kindness and great intent. And so it's not that people are deliberately going out to communities and doing things that aren't effective. It's that they don't know what they don't know. And so you take someone out to, say, a remote area of the Kimberley as an example, the culture is so extraordinarily complex that people just become paralysed because all they have to rely on is their clinical expertise, which is useful. But you still need to have a cultural understanding to even get in there and start the conversation. So they're being set up every day to really operate in culturally unsafe ways.
And there's so many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures all around Australia. Do you feel that each community would benefit from having somebody who's culturally informed of their specific area in psychology?
Yeah, there is. But what I think, the reason why the field has failed to progress substantially is that there is this continued, deferral of responsibility on behalf of Aboriginal people to train non-Indigenous people all the time. And look, that's really essential. It's critical. It's a critical part of your first, step to understanding a community well and local context well. However, what I'd really like to see again is people really taking significant professional responsibility, and that starts with university training, to understand the sorts of skills they need to focus on themselves, so that, if ultimately when they have an Aboriginal person in front of them, they still need to be able to understand how to exercise their clinical skills in a way that's effective. So it's a two-way street, but most importantly, people really need to dedicate time to cultural supervision and to those sorts of things that increase their skills.
And a big portion of mental health treatment in Australia could be described as the quote-unquote medical model. How do you feel Indigenous Australians' spiritual and social and emotional well-being is being addressed when dealing with mainstream hospitals and community centres with treating their mental health?
Yeah, I think, obviously badly. We just have to look at the statistics to really ensure that. However, what we also need to do, and we haven't done well in Australia as Indigenous people, is really promote this idea of Indigenous mental health. Social emotional wellbeing is a really, really, really vital construct, but what's actually happened, unfortunately, is social emotional wellbeing is being sold as being mental health, where it isn't. So essentially what we need to do is we need to ensure that practitioners are able to unpack mental health in a way that incorporates all the components of colonialisation, trauma, removal policies, racism, and all those sorts of things within a standard mental health assessment. So then what can happen is people can understand why people are feeling the way they are and treat people in accordance with actual mental health complaints, such as trauma and such as depression. At the moment, we actually don't have any robust data in Australia on mental health, Indigenous mental health. And so that is a really significant contributor to why we're seeing suicides in particular escalating.
So how do you feel we can start addressing it? You mentioned education at universities. Is there anything else that you can think of that could help us as a country address Indigenous Australian mental health better?
Yeah, the first thing, and I've talked about this a lot, the first thing we need to do is we need to establish causal pathways. We haven't actually dedicated real good energy into determining causal pathways, actually explain the why, and I'm looking particularly at suicide, obviously, because I'm more concerned about that. But we haven't done something as fundamental as explain to our communities who are bereaved and are now experiencing the highest rates of child suicide in the world why their children are dying by suicide. And what we know in the mainstream is that they've established causal pathways for suicide for decades now. And what that then means, if we understand the why in terms of a cause, that then informs the what, which is the treatments of best practice. So if we just do those two fundamental things, that would actually considerably change what we're doing in relation to suicide prevention at the moment, because it enables us to focus really clearly on what the causes are, enables us to apply treatments of best practice. Most importantly, it enables us to measure the impacts of treatment programs. So currently we don't have a database that actually shows us whether suicide prevention programs in this country, Indigenous suicide prevention programs in this country, are actually being effective in reducing suicide risk. So they're actually really simple things to focus on, and I guess that's what I'm spending most of my time doing.
In your experience, what do you think is the why for this alarming statistic?
Yeah, well, it's simple in the sense that my PhD focused specifically on this. I developed the world's first unique screening tool for at-risk Aboriginal people, and it's in youth and adult version. And so what we actually did fundamentally is we went out and sort of said, look, other suicides, does the nature of Indigenous suicide look different? We had a hunch that maybe the risk factors were different, but we really wanted to test that using unique assessment tools at a population level. And what we found, really interestingly, that the suicides are really different. They look different in the sense that they're quicker, they're more impulsive in terms of, the pattern tends to be 82% of cases an interpersonal relationship breakdown. Then what happens is people look like they overreact, and that's very common with people that have compromised attachment, the origin of which obviously is in removal policies. And then what happens is trauma feeds trauma. We know that. Once you have a trauma as a kid, you're more likely to have a trauma as an adult. You put whole communities, the nature of Aboriginal communities is that we're confined and we're isolated. So then what happens is you get a bunch of people with trauma in one environment that are doing, that are swapping trauma back and forth. And then what happens is you get lots and lots of issues around impulse control where people look as if they overreact into personal conflict. And then the suicides seem really quick. And so the fix is basically to look at how do we actually get in there and teach people impulse control strategies? Well, it's this thing called distress tolerance skills, teaching effective communication, problem-solving capacity, anger reduction. And so those sorts of things, it's critical that actually occurs across all of our high-risk communities.
So when you say it's impulsive and quick, does that mean that there could be less signs and ways of possibly seeing somebody that could be suicidal leading up to the incident?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And certainly we've had that. When we first started going out, once we established the causal pathways look different, of course, that was no surprise. When we go out to communities and people say, yeah, that's exactly what we're seeing. But the interesting thing is, the reason why people weren't picking it up is because we were told for a long time, based on mainstream research, that most people who died by suicide were depressed and would, isolate themselves from others, would internalise, would do all these things that what happened over decades, people were being skilled up around risk factors that were very mainstream risk factors, and they got good at that. They got good at looking for that and trying to pick that stuff up. However, because it was fundamentally flawed in terms of the risk factors look different, people weren't tuned into what to look for. So when we go out and say, this is what it looks like, you can see the light bulbs going off in people's heads going, we know exactly who you're talking about. So tragically, we had a 10-year-old young, beautiful girl up in Luma. It was very highly publicised that she literally had a conflict with a cousin and died by suicide very, very quickly. And that's a classic example of someone who just hasn't developed self-soothing strategies, and very easy to fix.
Yeah, it's truly something that, mainstream mental health doesn't acknowledge and look at. I know in all my training and education, we look at the signs leading up to suicide or a suicide attempt, and we're definitely not equipped to deal with an impulsive suicide. It's just not something that we encounter very often. And I know that you're saying it happens quite quickly, but what are some signs that we can look out in that very short period leading up to it?
I guess we need to also clarify that we're not suggesting that, like I had someone say, you're suggesting that these suicides are on a whim. And I said, no, that's not what we're suggesting at all. Absolutely. It's about patterns of dare I say, I hate using the term maladaptive, but you're looking for people who have patterns of responding, like overreacting to conflict in a way that looks like they overreact and don't have that ability to self-soothe and calm and bring themselves down. And that's something that people have as a pattern. And then they'll threaten suicide. So they're the sorts of things that people get tuned into. People can be tuned into the sort of warning signs. And then we give the community strategies to talk people down, to walk people down, at the same time as giving the individual strategies around distress tolerance skills and those sorts of things. But when you've got communities that are, like the Kimberley is a great example where they've carried the burden of suicide for such a long time. I'm hearing so much at a community level around the degrees of impulsivity across, youth crime, across adult crime, across suicides in particular, that we're just seeing that covering off so many of our statistics, in terms of people are now getting caught in those cycles that are just feeling quite normalised when you're putting people in environments where there's lots of people with compounded trauma.
We're speaking about that the suicide rates are the highest in the world for child suicide. Do you think that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people do build up impulse control and self-soothing strategies as they get older, since we're seeing such a high rate in children, but not such a dramatically high rate in adults?
Oh, look, it's still high. It's sort of, I think it's about 2.5 times the rate of the non-Indigenous population. It's just that the child suicide rate is particularly awful in relation to, 6 times the rate. So we're not actually suggesting that it's not low with adults, but it's I guess with children, as there's their cognitions. Children don't think in the same way as an adult, and so children, when they're in trauma, tend to model and mimic and mirror what's around them. And so that's no surprise that, children are just mimicking impulse control. We often will see then that as adults grow, yes, in some instances, people will actually develop self-soothing strategies and whether they get treatment or healing. However, it doesn't necessarily mean that they'll die by suicide. It could mean that they'll come into contact with the justice system. Or what we're finding, I guess, in the adult population is that there's very high rates of intimate partner violence. And so that's where, I guess, untreated childhood trauma tends to manifest itself as anger and impulse control at different levels.
Yeah. You founded the Westerman Julia Institute in response to the unacceptable rates of Indigenous child suicide. Can you tell us a bit about it?
Yeah, look, it's really great when initially the Julia Institute started from all this stuff and more that I've been already talking about, but it was sort of born out of frustration, and it's ended up being the most amazing, incredible journey, which is the good news. But essentially where it started was having, again, the forced success of government inquiry into suicides in the Kimberley, and I'm from a remote area myself, so I do get the reality of remote circumstances, and getting really frustrated with the fact that government just kept having inquiry after inquiry after inquiry. That all concluded that, children are dying as a result of a lack of access to culturally competent services. So I read the Fogliani inquiry, and 13 beautiful Indigenous children had died by suicide, and I just literally broke, and I thought, this can't continue. Someone has to do something. So that day I started the Dr Tracey Westernman Indigenous Psychology Scholarship Program through an investment of $50,000 of my own money to start a scholarship. So it's $10,000 a year. So there's a financial barrier that we're trying to eliminate that affects Indigenous people from studying quite dramatically. We know the research tells us that. So eliminate that bit. But I also personally mentor all of the students. So very quickly, we only launched 9-10 months ago, and very quickly we're now mentoring 15 and financially supporting 15 Indigenous psychology students from across Australia. And so that's a significant contribution already that, is going to really address the sorts of things that our communities have been crying out for over decades.
Sometimes the best things are born out of frustration, right? Just get
hopefully, yeah.
Sick of it and take it into your own hands. That's
definitely
amazing. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Tracey Westernman.
No worries at all. Thank you very much for the interest.
So I thought before we'd get started, would you want to do an acknowledgement to country?
I'd just like to thank and be grateful for the lands that we meet on today across this wonderful nation that's home to many different cultures and Aboriginal people and Torres Strait. We also acknowledge emerging past and present elders who are coming through and the wonderful caretakers that preside here across the nation.
I'm very much in line with Roy. I'd like to acknowledge all lands and that we meet on today, particularly both where Roy and I are. And I take you into consideration here in Sydney on the beautiful Eora land, where there's 29 different subclans made up of that nation. And I'd like to also pay my respects to elders both past, present and emerging. Welcome, acknowledge our Aboriginal brother there and our brother and sister from another nation as well, mate. Welcome, welcome, welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks, Roy.
Thank you.
So I guess we'll just get into it. So I'm going to record the proper introduction separately. So I'll just give a very brief introduction. So today we're going to be chatting to Bill, Roy and Leon regarding the Australian Indigenous mental health interview we just heard. Welcome, guys.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Bill and Roy, maybe you could give a little introduction to yourselves before we get started. We all know Leon.
My name's Bill. I'm a 60-year-old Gamilaroi Yuin man, very proud cultural person, and I have a very good interest in trying to amend the suicide speculation and rates within the nation. I sit on various panels and hear a lot of what I heard with Tracey Westernman. But also we've got to pay attention to that maybe a lot of Tracey's foundation work is probably coming from the remote regions of the Kimberleys and the Pilbara, where they're very traditional there. And we've got to recognise the differences in our cultures as well across the span of Australia. As we all know, the eastern side of Australia lost a lot of their culture, but slowly but surely our young people are starting to bring it back. So that's me from a bit of a nutshell. I sit on Suicide Prevention Working Group, a regional plan working group for government health body. So yeah, I guess I've got an interest definitely in suicide.
Thanks, Bill. And Roy, could we hear a little bit about you before we get into the interview?
Yeah, sure. Look, I'm on the advisory committee of the Adelaide Primary Health Network and have been for a number of years. You know, I had a lot to do with the PHNs and also SALAN, which is the Southern Adelaide Health Network, advisory committees and that kind of thing. Worked across a wide range of mental health in the past, being a FAMS worker, psychosocial work. Yeah, so I mean, something that's quite close to my heart, you know, from my own personal experiences within my family and from North Queensland. And I agree with Dr Tracey Westernman around impulse control and all this kind of thing. And also Bill there about, you know, like culture at the core. This is so important. And even in Adelaide here, there's a lot of displacement. I've been living in Adelaide for 13 years and, you know, already feel disconnected. Although I try and go back every year to North Queensland, you know, some things are starting to be forgotten, sadly. So I can't pass that on to my children. Or, you know, we don't have the old people around anymore in my clan. So we rely heavily on the elders of each clan to kind of take up that work. I also help a lot with the Black Dog Institute suicide prevention program at the moment, and that's called Under the Radar. So that's me.
Great to have you both. You've given, you know, a little bit of insight into how you felt about the interview with Dr. Tracey Westernman, but I'd love to hear more. It's undeniable that generational trauma has a huge impact on Indigenous Australian mental health. How do you feel this can be better addressed by mental health professionals?
I think we need to move away from the environment of guilt. People need to listen to the individual story, because when we go into a space like that, we're doing our own risk assessments and narrative therapy as well. Like hearing that story and having that yarn will definitely get people further, I believe. Because, I've had people say before, oh, they tried to catch me. And that's interesting language, that people are thinking that they're trying to be caught rather than helped. And that was a number of people. But because we take a holistic approach, like we can see that if somebody's being very judgmental and that kind of thing. And I think the lack of, like Dr. Tracey was saying, impulse control, it's either, yeah, right, we'll just leave that kind of approach, and I should have came here in the first place.
No, I totally agree with you there, Roy. Mate, I've had a few examples myself, especially when I served with corrective services, where listening was a big part of trying to assess and work out a healing pathway for particular people. And one of the things I do find is that you go into almost like a yarn circle, but there might be psychologists, doctors, and other social welfare people. And I'll give one example in particular. We were sitting around. I had a young fella. He was having problems. He could hear voices, that sort of thing. And I said, he's got to have company. He's got to be 2 out, and there's no excuse for it. Anyway, an agreement was reached. They had him heavily dosed on particular medicine, and he went back to his area within the centre. And I came in the next morning at 6:30, and he was found hanging on the end of a rope. Now, I put that all down to the fact that no one listened to him. He's supposed to be on 15-minute obs. Had someone taken the time to spend 5 minutes, even 10 minutes with him, we could have saved a life there. But unfortunately, that didn't happen. And another thing that could have been noticed was when he's talking about, I've got snakes inside of me. The poor fella had worms, internal worms, and it's just little things that people say that you can pick up a larger story from. And I've had a fair few occasions like that where it's resulted in someone's death. But I'm almost in agreement with the impulsive situations that lead to suicide. But I also know that listening and observing can take you a long way, and that's to the point of watching how a person behaves. If they've tidied up what you'd call their business and taken care of their space, everything's organised, and it's not a usual way for that person to act, then that's a warning sign that can be taken into account. So yeah, I totally agree with you, mate, that listening's a big part of it, and observing's another part.
Yeah, and look, I mentioned, the environment of guilt, and we need to move away from that, because the system, when a general interview or session starts, it's basically seeing how bad somebody is, like what wrong things have you done. And, that can be very demoralising for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. A good example is, a mother of 7 children with different disabilities rang the NDIS, and luckily I was there. And, you know, they kept asking for the first 10 minutes of the phone call at the beginning, they were asking about whether she had a mailbox and why didn't she receive the mail? And this went on for 10 minutes, and I kept looking at her to give her support. And I said, and I used language like moving forwards, what can we do now? It's kind of obvious that she didn't get the letter, but we're here on the phone and we're willing to work through this. It was very shameful that this was the first contact someone would have with a professional, just about a mailbox. Yeah.
Yeah, it's some of those, the simplest things that people say, mate, that can actually lead you to other reasons. And if you're a regional or remote person, you know, you might live in a community where it's a central, as they all were in the day, a central postal drop area, then you may not get it. You know, someone or one of the kids might have picked it up by mistake and it's been thrown out. But there, what you're saying, you know, in order to help, you've spoken to her on the phone and allayed her fears of mind, and that's all it takes sometimes. You know, there are more serious times, but that there in an instance can be the biggest help you can ever give someone.
Can I ask a question? Both of you talked about the importance of telling a story, and that's a really important thing. And the work I've done in my personal experience as someone who's survived suicide, hearing the story is of key value. And I think you've both identified that clinicians or workers sometimes or mostly don't do it well. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think that boils back to what Dr. Tracey was saying too, you know, like in the initial training, it's almost like being in school. True history isn't taught. If you want to find out about true history, you really need to speak to people who've lived it and have walked a mile in their shoes, you know. But in this case, you've got to turn around and listen to everything that's being said. And with that, the cultural competency, I don't like the word of cultural awareness, because you've got to become competent at what you're doing, in my eyes. And if they're to turn around and actually put some of the stories into play that we've experienced, that other people have experienced, but then have had to call in personal culture to turn around and address the matter, I think that would go a long way. But remaining open to advice from the community or elders or someone within the family would take things a bit further, I think. So if that could be placed into the training aspect, it'd go a long way.
Roy, you were mentioning that a lot of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders speak about the concept of getting caught as opposed to getting treatment. How do you think, as a country, we can turn that view around? What needs to be done to make people of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander descent feel safe with mental health treatment?
Well, there's so many avenues to that question, but basically, like we're saying, you know, listen to someone's, like obviously when we present to hospital or wherever it is, things have gone to extremes. You know, like a lot of my family have presented to hospital and within weeks they've passed away. You know, because we believe that there's more to just presenting and getting, you know, mental health assistance. It's basically, we've got to make sure that we are safe, our homes are safe, you know, our families, our children. Even when I go for a checkup, they ask me how my children are, and I think, well, is that, you know, like, is that a symptom of my health, my children? And I often ask them why, and they get a little, you know, upset. But basically understand, and, you know, like my situation at the moment, I live in a bus, you know, an old bus in the forest, because I lived with a severe alcoholic. and it wasn't a safe place for my children. So I had to go run away and live in this bus until soon I'm moving into normal accommodation. But just the backstory and understanding what happened, it goes a long way. And and checking base, not just handing people, having a consultation, giving someone a lot of documentation to read, which they may not be literate, and saying, well, there you go away. Touch base later. I did a bit of cultural competency training with a gentleman here in Adelaide, and he said to me once, what we're giving the clinical people is we're giving them a heart. They have the education, we need to give them a heart to understand our people. And that kind of meant a lot, just that simple explanation, having a heart. But yeah.
Yeah, no, that's right, mate. It's the underlying issues that are the ones that could be the determinant of whether someone is on the verge of being suicidal or not. You'll notice by, like I say, the housekeeping, if you want to put it that way, of someone that's committed to taking their own life, the way in which they do it. But in order to make things better, we need to listen to that underlying story. We need to actually connect more with communities. And what I've found in New South Wales is that we don't have enough Aboriginal psychologists to go around. In some instances, if they're attached to an Aboriginal organisation, they may not want to go in there because of confidentiality matter, and these sort of things ring true within community. The other thing is the initial training and that we have to provide for our mainstream, and I hate that word, mainstream clinicians. It has to have a degree of community-based access so you can understand where people are coming from, because I think that's one of the biggest things. And listening to how a community mourns after an event like that, there's just that pure need for communication across both parties.
Thanks so much for that, Bill and Roy. But it's been a pleasure hearing your opinions and thoughts, and it's been really insightful for myself as someone who works in mental health, and I'm sure there are people all around Australia who can relate to what you're saying. Thank you so much.
No worries. Thank you.
Hi there, folks. I'm Chris Jager. On today's Out of the Box, we're going to be taking a look at Aboriginal mental health, as well as the positive impact that physical activity can have on mental distress. My guest is Andrew Thorpe, a Gunai and Gunditj Mara man living on Boonwurrung country. Andrew is a proud father of 2 girls who rediscovered his love of running in 2020 after the suicide of a close friend in 2019. Research shows that Indigenous people in Australia are twice as likely to die by suicide than non-Indigenous Australians. In the last year, Andrew has run 255 kilometres for the Black Dog Institute's 1 Foot Forward campaign. He also ran his first marathon for the Indigenous Marathon Project. Andrew is on the line now. Andrew, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
First of all, what was your relationship like with physical activity and sport growing up? Were you like a sporty kid and teenager?
Yeah, definitely was. Pretty much any team sport I sort of excelled in. I'm not much of an individual player. I don't like I like to sort of handball the credit of a lot of things, but I do get the enjoyment out of team sports, definitely.
Marathon running, is that more of an individual sport?
It's definitely an individual sport, and it's a tough one because the whole journey of the marathon training and the running, it wasn't so much. Wasn't seeing it as a sport. I was seeing it as my mental health training, I guess. It really helped with me making sure that my mental health was great, and it was my time to reflect on what I was doing at the time.
Did you notice, I guess, if you didn't run for a period of time, like a dip in your mental health?
Yeah, I definitely did. I, even to this day, like this last 2 weeks, I'm currently in quarantine, and it's been hell. And I don't have a treadmill or anything, and my backyard, although I've got a bigger backyard, it's not big enough to go for a good enough run to clear my mind. And even my wife would always say to me, when I'd be, getting down or whatever with work or just life in general, she'd actually start yelling at me and saying, "You need to go for a run. You need to go out there."
So it's pretty closely linked to mental health for you.
Yeah. I didn't realize at the start until I did start to feel better, and it was, a lot of people have lots of different things. My cousin, he's just started his own little fruit and veggie garden in his backyard, and that does it for him. For me, it's definitely running.
What did the loss of your close friend to suicide help you realize about your own mental health and well-being?
When it happened, I was running my own business. I had a lot of things going on in my life at the time, and I found that I was actually neglecting the important things in my life with my family, my kids, more importantly, and also, friends and extended family, and just taking time for myself. And he was always like, we'd talk. He lived up on the Central Coast, New South Wales. He moved up there with family, and we talked a lot. And I'd always, ask about his family. He'd ask about mine, and we'd say how good things were. But then I spoke to him a week before he committed suicide, and he was telling me how great everything was. So, I told him how good it was for me as well. So I actually sort of seen that I was believing my own lies about my life as well. If, he was telling me how good he was, and obviously he wasn't, and I was always there to share, but he, whether he felt comfortable or whatever the reason was, he didn't want to say anything to me. So that's why I changed my whole attitude on everything. I actually closed up my business because I couldn't do it and have a family life just the way I ran it. I know there's a lot of people out there that can do it, but also it changed the way I talk to people now. I don't ask a question that gives me a yes or no answer when it comes to people's mental health. I try to get more in depth with it, like instead of saying, something so simple as "how are you?" and you get a "yeah, good," or if I do get that answer, I try and get further in depth on it, because I know I used to do that, and I still do, to be honest. Sometimes it's a hard thing to break, the way our mindset is, but it's always, I'm trying my best every day, and I like to think that I'm hopefully going to be helping someone else that was in my position or my friend's position.
That automatically saying that, "Oh, I'm fine," is such a automatic reaction sometimes, and especially with work colleagues, with friends. It can be just sort of an off the cuff answer, but it's not really getting to the depths of how you're actually feeling.
No, that's right. In construction, obviously I work in construction. So in construction, I find it a lot where we don't say hello or hi or anything like that. We say, "How you going?" Like you say, the common answer is, "Yeah, good." And that's them saying, "How are you going?" There's no in-depth thing, or it's not as easy to get that in-depth answer out of you. And so I've had a few builders that I've worked with in the past, and I knew if they asked me how I was going, it was a 5-minute conversation. And at that time, I used to think, I don't have time for this. But now I'm changing my mindset to be one of those builders. I want to be that person where people know, I want to know about your family, your kids, your day, your week. I try and pick up on the cues, and not everyone shows them. I know I don't, but I try to pick on the cues of, how people are, if they are looking a bit dull, or, not as energetic, or maybe they're always dull and now they are energetic, the changes in their persona.
Those little little cues. And often there's a lot of non-verbal cues as well in terms of eye contact and posture and stuff like that.
Yeah, definitely. And I work with many people at work, and just someone that's there every day an hour early, they're late sometimes. I pull them aside, not because they're late, because at the end of the day everyone's got things going on, but it's just so they know I am there. I'm available to talk if there is something going on.
That's great that you're actively choosing to be that person in your work environment.
Yeah, I do my best, and no one's perfect, and sometimes I miss it and someone else points it out to me. I'm trying to build that reputation that even if I do miss it, people know they can come to me to talk to a certain person, or there's avenues there. I know I've guided one person that works for us at the moment. I've guided them to another colleague because they've known each other for years and I'm just new to the company. So it's, I just don't have that reputation with him, and that they're getting along great and they're dealing through their issues. And, it just wasn't my place to get involved at that time.
And it's about, guiding people in the right direction as well, or to somebody that they can feel like that they can open up to, or that they have a relationship with.
Yeah. One thing I've learned pretty quickly is, and I'm glad I learned it, was that, I can't fix you. I can only help you fix yourself. And I suppose I'm learning it firsthand because I'm still going through issues myself. And no matter who I talk to, everyone's got an answer, and that might have helped them, just like running is helping me, but it may not help you. But if you find if you find your running, that's what's going to help you.
And it's about guiding people and being there to support. And sometimes it's about, rather than problem solving, just being a listening ear.
Yes. Yeah. And there's a difference between listening and hearing what people have to say as well. You can hear a lot of things and it goes in and out. It's the listening that's the key.
That active listening and actually taking the time to talk to somebody for 5 minutes, like you were mentioning earlier.
Yeah. And following up on certain questions, as simple as, it doesn't even have to be directly them, about their kids or their friends or their work, remembering that small cue, because then I know, again, my personal opinion, my personal things that have happened with me, I have always noticed, like the builders I mentioned earlier, I knew that they cared and they listened, because a week or two down the track, they're following up on what happened at that time, asking how the kid's birthday went, or asking how school's going, or whatever it might be.
In the construction industry, generally, what is the attitude towards mental health, or towards being able to say, hey, I'm not okay?
If you asked me this question 5 years ago, I would have said non-existent. It's toughen up, get through the day. But the environment and the culture is completely changing. The old school mentality is getting pushed out, really. It is the easiest way to put it, because it's not that they are trying to harden you up or anything like that, but they just didn't know better. The older generation didn't know, or they didn't want to know. So they're not learning what we are learning today. Also, people like myself, I'm not the only one out there, and especially in my position where I am, there's plenty of us. We're getting put through mental health first aid now. We're getting a lot of, Are You Okay days, Black Dog Institutes, all of these places you can approach and talk to that help you out. There's a lot of awareness being put out there these days, and it's really good. And my workplace, for one, at this moment, they're big and they're pushing it, and they put Are You Okay days on at my work, and we hand out donuts, and it's about starting that conversation, because that's what helps at the end of the day.
It's what advice do you have, I guess, for somebody who's struggling with mental distress and mental health, but finds the thought of starting physical activity overwhelming?
Getting into physical activity, no matter what it is, it's always going to be overwhelming, whether you got mental illness or you don't. I suppose that the thing that I take note of and really try and push when I'm talking to people about it is don't see it as a physical activity or a sport. See it as doing something that you like and that or you love doing. I used to play footy all the time. I gave it up for my work because I didn't want to get injured. And I loved footy though. Like, I had a huge passion for footy. I'd be there all the time, every game. When I lost that, I went straight into work and lost everything. So getting back into running, I think I enjoyed footy so much because I enjoyed my running. And now that I'm running and there's less chance of an injury, I'm in love with it. I'm passionate about it. So I don't see it as I'm going out to get fit. I see it as I'm going out to clear my mind and do what I got to do to make myself better. So, as I said earlier, runnings might not be your thing. It works for me. There's so many things out there. As long as you enjoy it, and when you're finished, you're walking away with a smile on your face, that's the key. I've trained people now. I've given advice about running. And when they're starting, I don't tell them to go for times or distances. I say run until you're really happy and then just stop. Because otherwise, if you push yourself, you're going to hate what you're doing and then you're not going to enjoy it and you're not going to do it again. So it's always when you got a smile on your face, you're enjoying what you're doing.
Absolutely. Can you tell me more about the Indigenous Marathon Project?
So it's a really great cause. It's a not-for-profit, and it's run by Rob De Castella. He's a champion marathon runner. His story himself, he tells us all that he was always looking for the next champion as marathoner. He's trying to help out. He's seen the Indigenous community, and he's always wanting to find and help provide for that next generation and the up and coming runners. And it started out like that, to find the next Aboriginal Olympic runner, and then it's grown from there to actually be that he's not just helping myself as a graduate from the program, but he's helping my community that's behind me.
The statistic that Indigenous people in Australia are twice as likely to die by suicide than non-Indigenous Australians. What are some of the things that you'd like to see put in place to address this and close the gap?
It is a tough question because at the moment, the government's trying it, the communities are trying it, the healthcare system's trying it. I guess the thing that I see growing up in the communities and, with the suicides all around me, the help that's given, I suppose, at the moment, I personally don't really see it as help, more of a pat on the back. We want to make ourselves look good, get this program up and running, and then we go on to bigger and better things, and you're still left with your health issues or your mental health or whatever it might be. So programs that are in place, like the Indigenous Marathon Program, not everyone can get into that, but there's other avenues to get involved in things that are always going to be there. Clothing the Gap at the moment, they're a huge clothing business, and not a social enterprise, but they're more than that, because the money that they're gaining and earning from just some amazing clothes, they're putting back into the community to create programs and health awareness out there. So as far as what I'd like to see in place, I suppose, is more full-time and actual efforts, not just to make yourself look good, but to actually make Australia a better place for Aboriginal people to live in, and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to live in. Because, I've got fair skin. I've grown up, my family's pretty prominent in the community. And even I've had the effects of, mental health and racism issues and things like that. So for all of my, brothers and sisters out there that have, had it worse than me, I couldn't imagine, even going through that, from what I've gone through. So, that's why I try to do my best to promote what I'm doing, because, as I said earlier, if I can help at least one person, get through a battle, then I'm going to be happy with myself, but it will also help me get through what I'm going through. So
you get, I guess, by helping and supporting others, you get that reciprocal effect where it also has a positive impact on you.
Definitely. It's one thing that's while I haven't been able to run, I've been trying to do my best to help other people to get that same. It's a selfish reason. I can see that, but it's also helping me, helping them. We're all trying to get to the one common goal, that's better mental health and get rid of the stigma around it.
Well, thanks so much for chatting, Andrew. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to It's a Minefield. This program has been kindly funded by the Mental Health Commission of New South Wales and broadcast on community radio station 2RRR in Sydney. Produced by Leon Fernandez,
Caroline Savransky,
Chris Jager, with executive producer Jeff Furlow. You can reach out to us on Instagram and Facebook with the handle It's a Minefield, or get in touch via email info@iamf.org.au. See you on the flip side, June bugs.